that's been sitting, something that's sitting with me for a bit, right? So this morning I sent my daughter every or I started sending her messages each day, and today I sent her a message about pigeons and eagles, and I want to talk to y'all about that, right? So the idea of pigeons and eagles didn't come to me, as some clever, metaphor. Um, I wanted to use, that I wanted to use on a Monday, but it came to me from a realization that, some time ago, right, about myself that I didn't initially like. There were seasons in my life when I genuinely believed that I was soaring. I was busy. I was getting all these degrees. I got 6 degrees. I was building, I built a 7-figure company, and I was moving. And from the outside, it may have even looked like elevation. But when I slowed down and examined my decisions more closely, I realized that much of what I was doing was happening at ground level, right? I wasn't necessarily failing, but I wasn't truly rising either. I was reacting, I was adjusting, I was making choices based on what was directly in front of me instead of what was ahead of me. And that's what pigeons do. If you've ever stopped long enough to watch pigeons, pigeons live close to the ground. Their world revolves around what drops in front of them. You drop a piece of bread, they're going to scurry to the bread to eat it. They aren't evil, and pigeons aren't foolish. They're simply conditioned to respond to immediacy. Whatever crumb falls in front of them becomes direction. Whatever appears becomes their focus. Their movement is reactionary, not visionary. So when I started reflecting on certain seasons of my life, I saw that pattern in myself. I had made decisions based on comfort rather than conviction. I had adjusted my altitude to match the room that I was in. I had softened certain parts of my vision because flying too high can make other people uncomfortable. And sometimes, if we're being honest, staying low feels easier than carrying the weight of elevation. You see, there's a strange safety in blending in. When you don't when you don't stand out too much, you don't attract too much criticism, right? When you don't stretch too far, you don't risk falling as visibly. And when you don't rise too high, you don't feel the isolation that can sometimes accompany the altitude. And I know a lot of you in here tonight have felt that, right? When you rise too high, people don't like that. It makes people feel uncomfortable. You said, and it can be dangerous in some environments. You're right. And here's the thing. But what I began to notice was that comfort was slowly shrinking my perspective, and then storms came. Pressure seasons have a way of revealing what's really happening beneath the surface. You see, there were moments when plans didn't unfold the way that I expected. There were setbacks that forced me to confront parts of myself that I hadn't fully examined. And there were disappointments that challenged not just my strategy, but my identity. What a lot of what nobody knows is that there was a season in my life where after building a business to 7 figures, I was homeless, right? I didn't, I had lost my apartment, I had lost my car, I had lost everything. And see, what surprised me in all of these seasons of life wasn't the presence of the storm, it was my instinctive response to it. And instead of leaning in, my first impulse was to retreat, to wait, to hope that things would calm down before I made another move. You see, I told myself that I was being patient. I told myself that I was being wise. But underneath that language was something else. You see, I was uncomfortable with resistance. And that's when the eagle metaphor started to take shape for me. You see, eagles don't avoid the wind, they don't wait for the storm to pass before they rise. They actually use the wind, the very force that unsettles small birds like pigeons. Um, the same force that unsettles them becomes the mechanism that lifts them higher, right? The turbulence isn't something they fight against frantically, it's something they position themselves within. So if you see an eagle is going to rise above the storm because it's the storm that propels it further using less energy. And I had to ask myself a hard question, right? If I truly believe I was designed for altitude, why was I so determined to live at ground level whenever pressure appeared?
Mm.
Because here's what I realized: eagles can land on the ground, they just don't live there. The ground is temporary, the sky is identity. And somewhere along the way, I had allowed temporary landing to become permanent patterns. I had mistaken comfort for wisdom and retreat for discernment. But storms weren't punishing me, they were positioning me. Pressure wasn't dismantling me, it was clarifying me. You see, the issue, if I'm being honest, the issue wasn't whether wind would come. Wind is inevitable. The issue was whether I understood how to use the wind, the storms, the pain, the struggle in my life. How many of y'all know how to use your pain and your struggle, or are you deterred by it? And that realization shifted something inside of me. I appreciate that. I began to see discomfort differently. I stopped interpreting resistance as a sign that I was off course. And instead, I started asking whether the resistance itself was an invitation to rise. I started questioning whether the storm was actually an opportunity for elevation that I had been mislabeling as obstruction. The truth is, living at altitude requires a different kind of internal stability. It requires trusting that you were built for something beyond what is immediately in front of you. It requires believing that the same wind that unsettles others can strengthen you if you allow it. See, there's a lot of pigeons around you. So, but you have the opportunity and the decision to determine if you're going to be a pigeon or if you're going to be like the eagle. And I'm not saying that I mastered that overnight. What I'm saying is that I became aware of the difference between landing and living, between reacting and rising, between surviving at ground level and soaring at sky level. That awareness right there is what changed how I see storms. It changed how I see pressure. It changed how I see myself, because storms don't break eagles, they elevate them. But elevation only happens, and I need you to hear this, when you stop running from the wind and start positioning yourself within it. That's where this conversation begins tonight. Because when I stepped back from my own reflection, I started noticing something larger than just my personal patterns. This wasn't just about me learning how to interpret storms differently. It was about recognizing how easy it is for entire communities to live at ground level without ever realizing it. That's why they say birds of a feather do what? They flock together. And that's so true, because pigeon behavior is not dramatic, it's subtle, it's culturally reinforced, it's often rewarded. See, we live in an environment that constantly trains us to respond to whatever drops in front of us. Notifications dictate attention, trends dictate dictate focus. Opportunities that promise immediate validation pulls us off course, because before we're even able to evaluate them. It doesn't feel reckless because everyone else is doing it. It feels normal. And that's what makes it powerful, right? When you are surrounded by people who are also reacting to crumbs, reacting to approval, reacting to comfort, it becomes difficult to recognize that you've lowered your altitude. So I want you to take a moment to think about the people that are hanging around you. If you hang around four broke people, I guarantee you will be the fifth. See, because the flock feels safe, the rhythm feels familiar, and there's a collective reinforcement of staying where things are manageable. You don't stand out, you don't disrupt the flow, you don't challenge the ceiling, but you also don't rise. You stay right where everybody else in your circle is. See, I've watched people adjust their convictions to maintain belonging. I've seen individuals with enormous potential shrink themselves in rooms that could not contain their vision, not because they lacked courage, but because elevation creates tension, and tension is uncomfortable. How many of y'all have seen the dynamic of where somebody, rises out of the hood, let's say, and then everybody who they used to hang out with start to talk about them and criticize them as being too good, right? See, when conversations get difficult, the instinct is often to retreat into silence rather than to stand in clarity. When standards require sacrifice, compromise feels easier. When ambition requires discipline, distraction feels more appealing. And none of this happens overnight. And that's the part that makes this so dangerous. See, altitude isn't usually lost in one dramatic decision, it's lost incrementally. A slight lowering of the expectations here, a small compromise there, a repeated choice of comfort over calling. And eventually, what was meant to be a temporary landing becomes the place you build your life. And the entire time, you still believe you're soaring because you're busy. And that's the collective illusion that I'm talking about tonight. We equate motion with elevation, we equate activity with growth. How many times have I've caught myself, right? When people say, "Oh, I've just been real busy," and we say something like, "Oh, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that you're busy." No, not always. It's not. And see, because but the movement at ground level is not the same as rising into the sky. And I want y'all to hear that tonight. The difference is perspective. Because from the ground, everything feels urgent. Every crumb looks significant. Every reaction feels necessary. And you are constantly scanning for what's next, what's available, what's safe. But from altitude, urgency shifts. You begin to see patterns instead of moments. You begin to see direction instead of distraction. And you stop chasing what drops in front of you and start pursuing what's ahead of you. See, the challenge is that elevation often feels lonely long before it ever feels liberating. And when you rise above the noise becomes distant. When you stop reacting to every opportunity, people who are still chasing crumbs may not understand your restraint. When you refuse to lower your standards for comfort, those who benefit from your compromise may interpret it as arrogance. I want to say that again. When you refuse to lower your standards for comfort, those who benefit from your compromise may interpret it as arrogance, or you a goody two shoes, right? This is where many people descend back to the ground with the pigeons, not because they lack ability, but because they crave acceptance. See, there is something deeply human about wanting to belong. There is nothing wrong with community, but community built on shared stagnation will not sustain your growth. If everyone is comfortable at ground level, rising will feel like rebellion when it's really not, right? And yet, storms storms don't ask for permission before they arrive. Storms just happen. And if you live in the South, right, you understand a little bit about that. See, pressure doesn't wait for you to feel ready. Wind comes whether you are prepared to use it or not. And the difference is how you respond when it does. And see, what I've learned is that some people interpret resistance as confirmation that they should retreat. When things get hard, when the struggle comes, people retreat. They assume that the discomfort means that they're not meant for elevation. But often, resistance is the very indicator that you're stretching beyond familiar limits. The culture may reward comfort, but your calling rarely does. When you begin to see this collectively, you realize that the pigeon and eagle metaphor is not about superiority, it's about orientation. It's about whether your life is shaped by immediate reactions or long term vision. Ground and I want you to know this, right? Ground level living is reactive. Sky level living is intentional. Ground level living seeks safety. Ground or sky level living seeks perspective. Ground level living waits for conditions to improve, whereas sky level living uses conditions as leverage. We're talking about pigeons and we're talking about eagles tonight. And I want you to be able to think, to think, and not as judgment, not as critique, but think about which one you are. Are you the pigeon or are you the eagle? Are you settling for breadcrumbs or are you soaring above the clouds? And because what I've observed is that many people sincerely want to be the eagle. They want elevation, they want growth, they want impact, but they are uncomfortable with the wind required to achieve it. They're uncomfortable when things get hard, when a struggle comes to their life. They pray for promotion, but resist preparation. They desire influence, but avoid isolation. They want clarity, but stay immersed in noise. Are you the pigeon or are you the eagle tonight? And here's the thing, regardless of if you're the pigeon, it's not because of a lack of a desire. It's a lack of altitude training. And that's what makes this conversation collective rather than individual. Because when you decide to rise, you're not just changing your perspective, you're stepping out of a pattern that many people around you have normalized. So if you see patterns, if you see a bunch of people hanging out in one area doing a certain thing, you probably need to go the other direction. And that takes courage. It takes internal stability. It takes the willingness to be misunderstood for a season. Just because everybody else is doing something doesn't mean that you should. Because here's the truth, the sky is not reserved for a select few, it is available to anyone willing to learn how to use the wind. Airplanes aren't reserved, for certain individuals. All you have to do is get the licensing and the aircraft and you'll be able to fly. And that's where we began to shift from observation to alignment. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you realize that you've been living at ground level like pigeons, the only real question becomes whether you're ready to rise. And so, my question tonight, before we go any further, is: are you ready to rise? Are you ready to be like the eagle instead of the pigeon? Because here's the thing: when we move this conversation right into the spiritual dimension, the metaphor becomes less about personality and more about alignment. Because scripture doesn't describe elevation as something reserved for the boldest personality or the most naturally gifted individual, right? It doesn't describe it as something only reserved for the charismatic people, right? It describes elevation as something connected to hope, positioning, and trust. I want you to remember that: hope, positioning, and trust. I'm going to say that again: hope, positioning, and trust. Isaiah 40 and 31 says this: but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not get weary. They will walk and not faint. Right, like the poem by Maya, right? So, what strikes me about Isaiah 40 and 31, right, is what it does not promise. It does not promise the absence of wind. It does not promise that storms will bypass you if your faith is strong enough. It does not promise that resistance will dissolve once you pray correctly. It promises renewed strength. It promises endurance. It promises soaring. That language assumes wind. That language assumes heartache, pressures, struggles, disappointments. You cannot soar without something pushing against you. You cannot rise without resistance. The eagle metaphor in Isaiah is not a poetic decoration, it is instructional imagery. It tells us something about how growth actually works in the kingdom of God. Hope in the Lord is not passive. Some translation says, though they that wait on the Lord, right? It's not passive optimism, it's positioning. It is anchoring your identity in something stable enough that when the wind comes, I'm going to say that one more time. When the wind comes, you are not destabilized by it. That is where many people misinterpret pressure. We assume that if God is with us, the path will be smooth. But scripture repeatedly shows that God's presence does not eliminate resistance, it transforms how we engage with it. And I'm going to say that another way, it transforms how we view the pressure. Think about it. Moses had resistance, David had resistance, Paul had resistance, but none of them were spared wind. What differentiated them was not the absence of storms, but the orientation of the trust. When your hope is anchored in outcomes, wind feels like disruption. When your hope is anchored in God, wind becomes development. This is where alignment matters. Eagles do not flap frantically when wind intensifies. They do not panic. They simply adjust their wings. They position themselves in a way that allows the current to carry them higher. That positioning requires instinct and trust. It requires knowing that the same force that could knock you down can also lift you up if you align yourself correctly. Spiritually, and I want you to know this, spiritually, that alignment looks like surrender, not passive resignation, but active trust. It means, and here's what it means, it means that you stop interpreting every uncomfortable moment as evidence that you're off course. It means that you begin to ask whether the discomfort is actually stretching you into the capacity required for what you've been praying for. And this is where I appreciate that. There are seasons, right? There are seasons when we ask God to remove the storm, and sometimes He does. But there are some other seasons when we're praying for someone, someone to be healed, someone to be, to be spared from something that they're going through health wise. But God doesn't do that. And instead, in those seasons, He strengthens our wings instead through disappointment, through loss. And if we misunderstand that strengthening process, we will mislabel growth as opposition. This is where maturity begins. Maturity is recognizing that elevation requires inner stability. It requires identity that is not determined by applause, not shaken by criticism, not inflated by success, and not diminished by setback. That kind of stability does not come from talent, it comes from rootedness. Hope in the Lord renews strength because it stabilizes identity. I'm gonna say that a different way. Waiting on the Lord renews strength because it stabilizes identity. If your identity is tied to your comfort, you will descend when pressure rises. If your identity is tied to calling, you will ascend when conditions feel unstable. This is not about ambition for ambition's sake. It is about alignment with design. If God designed you for altitude, then ground level living like pigeons will always feel constricting. So I'm going to ask you another time, are you more like the pigeon or are you more like the eagle? See, you may adapt to the ground level thinking and ground level living for a season, but it will never fully satisfy you. Something inside of you will continue to sense that there is more horizon than you are currently allowing yourself to see. And when storms arrive, you have a choice. You can interpret the wind as rejection, or you can interpret the wind as refinement. You can assume resistance means retreat, or you can assume it means recalibration. This is where your prayer should shift from Lord, remove this to Lord, teach me how to use this. This is a difference between being protected from wind and being prepared for it. See, protection keeps you uncomfortable, or excuse me, protection keeps you comfortable. Preparation makes you capable. And scripture leans heavily toward preparation. They that wait, they that hope in the Lord, right? When Isaiah says they will soar on wings like eagles, he is not describing escape, getting away from the storm. He is describing capacity. He is describing how, that capacity, and how people whose internal strength has been renewed so thoroughly that they can rise within pressure rather than collapse beneath it. How many people have you seen collapse under the weight of pressure? That is the spiritual layer of this metaphor. God does not call you to pretend storms are easy. He calls you to trust that they are not meaningless. He does not promise a life without turbulence. He promises a strength that matches it. I recall in my life when I was going through my breaking season, when I lost everything, the one thing I kept being reminded of is that God does not waste pain. God does not waste struggle. God does not waste all the disappointments we experience. And when that truth settles in, something shifts in how we interpret our current season. We stop asking why the wind is here and start asking how are we meant to rise within it. Now, this is where this is a crucial point where this conversation shifts from observation to decision. You if you're being honest with yourself, you can identify if you're the pigeon or if you're the eagle, but you have a decision, because metaphors are comfortable until they become mirrors. It's easy to nod along, and say, that's right, that 100 in the chat when we're talking about culture. It's easy to reflect when we're talking about scripture, but the real tension shows up when the wind picks up in your own life and you have to decide how you are going to interpret it. And that's where you are right now. So let me ask you something gently, not accusingly, but honestly. It's an honest question, not to judge. Where have you been living lower than you were designed to live? Not in a dramatic sense, not in a failure narrative, just in orientation. Where have you been living lower than you were designed to live? Where have you allowed comfort to quietly dictate your ceiling? Where have you accepted breadcrumbs like the pigeons because they were easier to manage than calling? Because this is how ground level living usually shows up. It doesn't announce itself as compromise. It feels like wisdom. It feels like patience. It feels like being realistic, right? You tell yourself that you're waiting for better timing. When this happens in my life, when I get this, when I do this, you tell yourself that you're being cautious. You tell yourself that you're being strategic. And sometimes you are, no doubt. But sometimes you're simply avoiding wind. You're simply avoiding hard things. And there comes a time where we have to normalize hard things. We were made for hard things. You see, wind exposes things, wind forces adjustment, wind reveals whether your wings are strong enough for the altitude you say you want. How many times do you see them canceling flights for wind itself? You don't. And here's the hard truth. Most people pray for elevation, but few people prepare for isolation. Most people want influence, but they do not anticipate the tension that comes with standing out. Most people desire clarity, but they remain immersed in environments that reward distraction. So, the question tonight is not whether you have potential. You definitely have potential. The question is whether you are willing to rise into resistance instead of retreating from it. Because retreat is subtle. Retreat doesn't come screaming and shouting, right? No one says, "Oh, I'm running away from the storm. I'm running away from troubles. I'm running away from hard times." Nobody says that. What retreat looks like is lowering your standards to maintain your comfort. What retreat looks like is adjusting your voice to preserve approval. What retreat looks like is staying in environments that no longer challenge you because they feel safe and familiar. But familiarity and a perceived safety is not the same as alignment. You can feel comfortable in a place that is slowly shrinking you, that's slowly diluting diluting your impact, right? And the longer you stay there, the more natural it feels. And that, my friends, is a dangerous place to be. When you're so numb to being comfortable and settling for breadcrumbs that you can't even recognize it. And that is why storms are necessary. Storms interrupt comfort, they disrupt routines, they force reevaluation. And when disruption comes, you can either interpret it as loss or invitation. If you are if you are grounded in fear, disruption feels like danger. If you are grounded in purpose, disruption feels like movement. I'll say that again. If you're grounded in fear, disruption feels like danger. And if you're grounded in purpose, disruption feels like movement. This is where you decide what kind of bird you are going to be, the pigeon or the eagle. It's one of the two. When conversations get uncomfortable this week, will you lower your altitude to keep the peace? Or will you rise into clarity even if it creates tension? Even in our council culture, when pressure increases in your career, will you interpret it as proof you should shrink? Or will you treat it as the training ground for greater capacity? When your growth requires separation from environments that feel safe but stagnant, will you descend to maintain belonging or will you ascend toward vision? These decisions are rarely dramatic, they are daily, they are incremental, they are often invisible to everyone except for you. But altitude is always determined internally before it is expressed externally. This is where courage enters the conversation because we could, you know, we have a choice just like Abraham had. We can be like Abraham who got an instruction and God said, go to a place that you don't know. He didn't know where he was going. It was uncomfortable, but he stepped out. He could have stayed in the comfort zone, but he went. See, courage is loud. It is quiet alignment. It is not loud. It is quiet alignment with who you know you were designed to be. It is refusing to react at ground level when you know that you were created for sky level thinking. It is trusting that the same wind unsettling your comfort may just be strengthening your capacity. You are not irresponsible for wanting more perspective. You are not arrogant for desiring elevation. You are not unrealistic for sensing that you were designed for greater altitude than your current environment allows. But here's the thing, elevation requires responsibility, it requires discipline. Elevation, if we distill it down, requires the willingness to sit long enough in discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. How many times have you been quick to say, God, get me out of this. God, deliver me from this. I don't want to feel this no more. I don't want to go through this no more. We've all been there. And here's the part that often goes unsaid. The higher you rise, the smaller certain storms appear. I'll say that again. The higher you rise, the smaller certain storms appear. Not because they disappear, but because your perspective expands. Things that once felt overwhelming begin to look manageable. Conflicts that once destabilized you began to feel temporary. Criticism that once defined you begins to lose its power. Altitude changes scale. Altitude changes scale. Altitude changes perspective. And perspective changes endurance. So when the wind comes this week, and it will come in some form. I want you to pause before reacting. I want you to sit and think before you react to the wind. Ask yourself whether you are responding as someone grounded in fear